Growing up, I lived in a very small town in Northern California that didn't even have a single streetlight. Where I lived was an old railroad hotel that had been turned into apartments. My whole family lived in that apartment complex at one point. There was 6 apartments, and 2 of my aunts lived in 2 of the apartments. My grandmother in one, my sister in another, and my mother and I in one. Also, and then there was another apartment that had another random person that wasn't a part of our family living in it. I have countless stories that I could tell you about, especially with paranormal experiences we had in that place, but these are just some of the more prominent ones that I think of often. We lived in one of the bottom apartments on the front side of the complex. I guess you would call it that, and obviously there was one apartment above us, and before my aunt moved in there, or out of there, I'm not sure, but it was vacant for a while. My mom would always clean out the empty apartments and get paid by the owner, so at this point in time, we knew for a fact that there was no furniture and no one in that apartment above us. I remember sitting in the living room with my mom and my sister talking, and all of a sudden, my mother shushed us and tells us to listen. We are sitting there, and all of a sudden, we hear loud scraping noises, like someone is moving around heavy furniture and pushing it across the floor in footsteps upstairs. We were baffled and a little creeped out because, like I said, we knew no one lived there at the time. Another time, she had seen a young boy with a dog while she was standing doing the dishes outside the window. This boy and his dog walked up the stairs and into the house and down the hall. At the time, she just assumed it was my cousin Andrew, who would always come over to play with us, and after she got done doing the dishes, she came to the room to see what we were doing, and of course, Andrew wasn't there. She was very confused and asked where he went, because she never saw him leave. But then I told her that he never came by, so she called his mom, and sure enough, he had been home the whole day. So my mother seen some sort of young boy spirit with a dog walk in the house and down the hallway, and was ultimately pretty creeped out by that one. Another time, she was cleaning out the middle apartment that was in the yard, and the people who lived there were absolutely disgusting. She literally had to rake out all the garbage off the floor, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, she started to hear a baby cry, and at the time, no one in the apartment complex even had a baby, so she was very confused, and it sounded like it was in one of the rooms in that apartment. I specifically remember her telling me it sounded like it was coming from a closet, but she looked and could not find said baby. I never really had any crazy experiences other than hearing people walking upstairs when no one is home, or the apartments were vacant, and the whole furniture situation, but the bathroom in our apartment was really creepy. I always felt like I was being watched in there, and every single person who showered in our house often experienced this a lot of the time. You would hear the bathroom door open and someone walk in, and when you would look, no one would be there. My sister once got out of the shower and went to her bedroom to get dressed, and she had shut her door all the way. And her door was a very heavy door, so it wasn't like the wind just could have pushed it open, and she said that it was latched completely, so even if there was wind, it wouldn't have just came open. But while she was getting dressed, she heard the door squeak, and she looked to see if it was one of us kids, and she said that she seen a black shadow peering in at her. She got so freaked out that she quickly got dressed and left the apartment, and wouldn't go back until my mom got home from work, and would not stay there alone anymore. After she moved out of that room, it became mine, and I never slept in there. Not once, because I just had this weird feeling about the room. The closet just had a dark look to it, and I always stayed far away from it as a kid. Another experience that my aunt had was she woke up in the middle of the night to see a white mist standing in the hallway, and when it noticed she was looking at it, it turned around and walked into her bedroom. She believed that one of them was an angel. I know a lot more happened, but I just can't remember it all at the moment. Maybe I'll talk to my family, and if I can't get any more experiences, I'll write it again. I've always been drawn to the paranormal since living in that place has wanted me to contact the owner somehow and do an investigation. Maybe one day I'll get the chance. I'm a 16-year-old male, and I used to be a bit skeptic to all things paranormal, until one weekend at an abandoned house. To give some backstory, I was with my two best friends at the time, Delaney and Julia. We were home alone and bored at Delaney's house with nothing to do. I can't remember whose idea it was, but one of us had the idea to drive around some of the old dirt roads and check out abandoned buildings. There are a lot of abandoned places around where we live. It's pretty far out in the country, surrounded by either farms or woods. So, we went to the first two old tobacco houses, took a few pictures, and just sort of goofed off. We got back on the road and saw an old, unkept driveway. Keep in mind, hardly anyone lives on this road. So, we decided to drive down the driveway, despite Julia saying we shouldn't because it didn't feel right to her. Not the fact that it'd be trespassing, just that she had extremely bad vibes about the place. However, Delaney and I insisted. We drove down it, and it went pretty far back into the woods. This is where weird things started to happen. We parked the truck in a little clearing, and noticed an abandoned house in the distance. However, before we got out of the truck, the front sensor went off, beeping like crazy. Then, so did the back one. It was if someone had walked around the truck. The weird thing about this is we were parked in a clearing, so there was nothing to make the sensors go off. Even if there were, they would have gone off before we would have even parked the truck, and wouldn't have just randomly gone off in that order. Delaney and Julia were kind of freaked out, but I just ignored it. It wasn't until later that this would freak me out too. We all got out of the truck and started walking towards the house. I was in front with my friends walking a decent distance behind me. If I'm honest, I was just showing off and acting fearless. I wasn't that scared until I saw her, a woman with dingy, unkempt-looking hair in a colonial-style dress, looking around the corner of the house. She looked at me and just put a finger up to her lips and shushed me very loudly. The feeling I had is almost indescribable. Imagine feeling as if all senses of safety and protection is gone, and you don't feel at all happy. My heart felt like it stopped. I started crying. I was so scared. I knew she wasn't human. I don't know how, but I just knew. I turned around to my friends and screamed and run and started sprinting back to the truck. My phone flew out of my pocket about halfway back to the truck. My friend Julia told me that this happened, and I told her to leave it. Now, if you know me, you know I'm ditching my phone if I'm serious. Julia's and Delaney got stuck back of the truck. We tried to open it, but it was locked. Delaney reached for her keys, but they were gone, and so was her phone. It's as if whatever this thing was trying to keep us there. Delaney ran back and picked up Julia and I's phones and found her keys. We got in the truck and floored it out of there, back to Delaney's house. You might think it's just coincidental. We dropped all of our things, but the thing is, our phones and Delaney's keys were all deep in our pockets. It didn't make sense for them to just fall out on their own like that. Later at the house, we were all talking about the entire situation, and I was explaining what I had seen. My friends didn't even hear the shush, nor did they see the woman. I was afraid they didn't believe me, but Julia reassured me the look on my face, and tears were proof enough for her to run as well. We later found that there have been few sightings of ghosts on that road by workers at Fort Pickett, which is a military facility nearby. Okay, so my dad has always been that type of guy where he doesn't believe in anything unless he witnessed it for himself. He's a pretty macho guy and isn't into all that fairy tale and ghost nonsense. Yet, that all changed for him one day. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon when my dad came home. He works the night shift at the old El Reno prison. He says it's pretty laid back and the job is easy for the most part. He'll usually drive around the prison in one of the guard trucks or keeps watch in the towers. But one night he was sent to do a sweep of the chapel, as to make sure no one was in there who wasn't supposed to be. His boss, let's call him Jack, told him to come back and check in with him after he had done so. My dad walked through the yard out to the chapel, and as soon as he walked in, he said he felt just a wave of nervousness come over him. He flicked on the old lights and walked in and began to check all around the room. After a couple of minutes, he said a man dressed in the same uniform as him walked out from the little office in the back. My dad asked the man if he was already doing the sweep of the chapel, and the man replied, "Yes, I'll take it from here." So, confused as to why he was sent out there to check the chapel, my dad just gave a little, "Oh, okay, I'll let Jack know." My dad returned to his boss about 15 minutes after he had sent him. Jack looked at him and asked, "How did you get done so fast? You couldn't have possibly checked the whole place in such a short amount of time." "Another guard already in there said he'd check it," my dad said. And I guess Jack didn't think anything of it. As long as the chapel was checked, everything was fine with him. Well, this is where it gets creepy. About 3 days after, my dad said he was walking down the halls of the prison and stopped to look at the display case of all the old photos of other guards in the past. As he was browsing the photos, he said his heart sank and his blood froze. One of the pictures he came across was that very same guard he had encountered in the chapel. Only this guard was now dead. Apparently, about 4 years before my dad started working there, a riot had broken out in the chapel, and a guard was stabbed to death, and that guard was the same man my dad had seen. But out of the 12 years of working there, not once had he ever heard about the riot until now. I don't know if they just don't talk about it, scared it might run off some newbies or something, or if it's just something a lot of them forgot about. All I can say is, my dad is now a firm believer in the paranormal, and not once has he ever gone back into that creepy-ass chapel. I'm 27 years old, male, live in the UK with my fiancé, and currently work as a teaching assistant for teenagers with special educational needs in a school not far from the Bradgate Park. I have worked in a number of schools and children's home now, and these buildings, especially the children's homes, are usually old, renovated houses or halls. This particular story happened in 2013, when I had just started working as a support worker at a care home for teenagers and young adults with autism, brain damage, and challenging behavior. The house that I worked in was pretty big. There were 2 living rooms, a large kitchen, a game room, a study, and 5 bedrooms. There was also a huge garden with a summer house activity room that led on to acres of fields and woodland. I had been working there for about 3 weeks and primarily worked the waking night shift. This shift ran from 10 p.m. until 8 a.m., and it was my duty to make sure all of the residents were settled for the night and to get the cleaning done before the day staff came in to take over. I would usually get all my jobs done for the night around 1 a.m. and spend the rest of the night listening out for anyone that woke up. I would watch TV, read my university course books, or sometimes just play games on my phone once I finished. The residents usually slept all night. On one particular night, though, a young man named James was particularly restless. He was not very big, but he had a lot of strength behind him when he got into one of his bad moods, and the slightest thing could set him off. He once threw a member of the staff through a patio door because she had forgotten to put cold water in his tea before he drank it. He could not form full sentences and would communicate with fairly simple words, put together in a way that he understood. For example, he would say something like, "James, make breakfast," when he was ready to make breakfast, or "James, go outside," if he wanted to go outside and play. He was generally well behaved and could be quite funny when he wanted to, but was well known for his temper. At around 11 p.m., James got up and came downstairs to make a drink. I stood in the doorway and watched just to make sure he didn't break anything or hurt himself, and he went back upstairs without any real bother. I sat on the top step and kept an eye on his door for maybe 15 minutes or so, just to make sure he didn't wake any of the other residents. Once he settled, I went back to my cleaning. The room beneath James's bedroom was a communal living room with board games, a TV, sofas, books, stuff like that. I was in there dusting and mopping the floor when I heard something heavy drop onto the floor in the room above. I knew James was prone to temper tantrums if he got frustrated, so I went upstairs and knocked on his door. As I reached for the key to open it myself, he opened the door and looked at me. He seemed perfectly calm, and his eyes looked almost half shut, like he had been asleep. I asked if he was okay, and he said yes, and put his thumb up. This was something he did when he was in a good mood and not stressed out, so I left him to it and told him to be careful, thinking that he had knocked something over. An hour or so passed, and by now I was in the kitchen cleaning the sink. I heard another bang above me, again like something had been dropped. This time I realized that the room above the kitchen was currently empty. The house was set up to house 5 residents, but there were only currently 4, and the room above me was the spare empty room. I immediately went to check it out, but the room was empty. I stood there for a while, and as far as I could tell, everybody was asleep. Due to the nature of their conditions and behaviors, each resident has an alarm fitted to their door that is activated at night, so if anybody leaves their room, a small receiver box that the night staff carry around makes a noise and a light blinks for a few seconds to indicate which door had been opened, which is numbered 1 through 5. The alarm had not gone off, so I knew that the noise was not from any of the residents. I got back to my cleaning and didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night. The following night, I got to work just before 10, and as I entered the hallway, I could tell that something was wrong. James was at the bottom of the stairs, covering his ears and humming loudly, and 3 members of staff were with him. After a few moments, he was escorted to the sitting room, and the house manager gave me a rundown of what had been going on. For the last 4 hours, James had been quite agitated and kept repeating the phrase, "Sarah, little girl," when asked what was wrong. This was something we had never experienced with him before, and the general conclusion was that he had seen something on TV or in a movie that stuck in his head and made him repeat the phrase. Once James had settled into bed, the night staff left the other member of staff that was sleeping in went up to the staff bedroom. I got on with my tasks and, as usual, finished around 1 a.m. Soon after this, I went upstairs to do a quick check on all the residents, but as I got on the first floor landing, I noticed the light had been turned off. There were 2 small corridors leading to the bedrooms on the left and right-hand sides of the staircase. James's room was on the left, and the light switch was just outside his room. I turned the corner to flick the switch, and there, in the darkness, in complete silence, was James. He was standing in the corner, completely naked, with his eyes as wide as he could possibly hold them. I'm a big guy, 6'3" and weigh about 220 pounds, but at that moment, I was really creeped out. I spoke calmly to James and asked what was going on, and for a while, he said nothing at all. Then, as I turned the light back on, he let out an ear-piercing scream and started slapping himself around the face. The sleep-in staff woke up at this point and helped me calm the situation and get James back into bed before reassuring the other residents that everything was fine. After that night, I had 4 days off. My shift pattern was 7 days on, 2 days off, followed by 8 days on and 4 days off, and I was relieved that this incident happened just as my time off began. I got back to work the following week and was told that the situation with James talking about that little girl had got a lot worse. He would spend hours staring out of the window that overlooked the garden, saying, "Little girl, where are you, little girl?" And no one knew where he had heard the phrase. That night, around 3 a.m., the alarm went off to say that the door to room 5, the spare room, had been opened. Now, this instantly seemed a bit weird as the door to the spare room is always kept locked because it was being used for storage at the time. I went up to investigate and found James standing in the room in the dark. He didn't seem to notice me entering and was just standing there whispering, "Where are you?" over and over again. I gently touched his shoulder and said something like, "Come on, mate, let's get you back to bed, it's late." James turned around and started heading back to his room, and for a second I was relieved. But then, as I locked the door to the spare room, he screamed out, "Oh no!" and started pummeling the door with both fists. As he did this, the alarm went off to indicate that the front door had been opened. The only people with the key to the front door were myself, as the night wake staff, and the house manager. The door has 4 locks on it, 2 that require a key, and 2 that require electronic ID cards. It was now 3:25 a.m., and the manager never came in before 8, so I presumed that he must have had some kind of mistake and continued to defuse the situation with James. He finally calmed down and went back into his room, so I went downstairs to check the front door. To my surprise, it was wide open. I shut it immediately and started checking every room in the house in case someone had got in. I then checked on each of the residents just to make sure they were still in the house. everything was fine. The next night, everything was calm until around 2 a.m. when one of the other residents, Connor, got up and said that someone was tapping on his window. I guessed that he must have just been dreaming, as his window was on the 3rd floor of the house and was at least 25 feet from the ground. I went back up to his room with him to reassure him and checked his window. Sure enough, it was shut, and the security lock that prevents it from opening wide enough for someone to fit through it was still sealed. As he got back in bed, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside of his room. He froze for a second and looked at me with an expression of pure panic on his face. I opened the door to see who it was, but no one was there. He was clearly scared by this and said, "Is he back?" My blood ran cold. I asked, "Is who back? What do you mean?" Connor looked over my shoulder and then sank down into his bed, pulling the covers up to his mouth. I turned around to see what he was looking at, but there was still no one there. "Tell him to go away," Connor said in a hushed, scared voice. I tried to reassure him that there was no one there and left his bedside lamp on before leaving the room. I went downstairs and sat outside on the patio with a cup of coffee. It was in the middle of January and around -2 outside, but I felt like I had to get out of the house for a while. After about 40 minutes, I went back inside and washed my cup in the sink, dried it, and put it on the back cupboard. Beneath the cupboard was a locked, secure drawer where all of the sharp knives are kept until needed. The drawer was open slightly. This was obviously a major issue as none of the residents were allowed access to the knife drawer without supervision. I counted the knives and realized that there was one missing, so I woke the sleep-in staff, told her the situation, and we began a search. Nearly 2 hours later, we still hadn't found this missing knife, so decided to just keep our guard up and make sure none of the residents were hiding it. 2 hours later, at 5:30 a.m., the alarm sounded. It was the door to the spare room again. I went up to check it out and found that the door was locked. How could the alarm have been activated by the door opening if the door was still locked? I went inside and turned the light on. To this day, I still have no explanation for what I found, and I often think about this incident. The bed had been pushed from its usual place and was against the wall, and the wardrobe doors were open. There were screws and nails all over the floor, but nothing broken. But the most disturbing part? In the middle of the room, there was a child's doll, a gold bracelet, and the missing knife from the kitchen. The doll was an old-style baby doll. My guess was that it was made in the 50s from the style of clothes and the overall look of the doll. The bracelet was simple but old-looking. I left everything as it was and reported it to the manager as soon as she arrived. No one ever claimed that the bracelet belonged to them, and it was taken to a charity shop soon after, along with the doll. After the doll and bracelet were removed from the house, James seemed to calm down and never mentioned a little girl or stood around in the dark again. I still don't have an explanation for everything that happened, and sometimes think that it was just a combination of strange behavior from a young autistic guy and the fact that that house was old. But on the other hand, a lot of stuff happened that I can't explain logically. My only regret now is that the doll and bracelet are gone and can't be examined or identified. Maybe it was paranormal. Who knows? But now I work day shifts and do not plan on working night shifts again anytime soon. This happened about 2 years ago, nearing the end of September. My aunt and her friend decided to fly up to New York from Panama to enjoy their mini vacation with my parents and I. Although many strange and paranormal experiences have happened to me ever since I was little, this event stayed with me and affected me more than any other experience. Here's the thing. Many things have happened to a lot of my family members, especially my aunt and her friend. We'll get back to that later though. So, it was around 10:30 at night. Keep in mind that my old neighborhood was a very calm and quiet place. Since I live near the countryside, not much action happens in the neighborhood. The neighbors were either elderly or young couples with smaller children. None that could have caused trouble around the neighborhood. There were only about 20 to 25 houses in the entire neighborhood that I lived in. Moving on, the three of us decided to stay up late to watch scary movies while my parents slept upstairs in their room. My aunt's friend was sitting near the slide doors leading to the backyard, while my aunt and I were sitting in the bigger couch near the front door. I was sitting on the left side where the door faced, and my aunt sat on the right side of me, which meant I was closest to the front door. We spent about 10 minutes debating on which movie we should watch. After those 10 minutes, we finally chose to watch Odd Thomas, which wasn't really a scary movie, but it was about a guy who could see spirits and demons. What a coincidence. We were only 2 minutes into the movie when I had a sudden urge to look at the door. I glanced back at my aunt and her friend, only to see them staring at the door as well. I looked back at the door for about 5 seconds, and then a loud bang came, and then another one, following after, and then a third one. All 3 bangs came from the front door, almost as if 5 people had just body slammed into the door 3 times. I thought it was going to fly off its frame. My first instinct was to run to the kitchen and grab a knife, but as I was about to do that, my aunt grabbed me by the shirt and told me to stay down. As I looked to my right, I saw my aunt's friend with her knees to her chest, rocking herself back and forth while my aunt just kept her gaze towards the door. While all 3 of us kept our attention to the door, next to it there were 2 small rectangular windows on either side of the door. The right window had a small curtain, and the left side was being covered with a small decorative tree. The small curtain had a gap in between of it because it was glued onto the window from the top area to the bottom area, leaving the middle part loose. At the moment of the bangs, it caused the middle area of the curtain to puff up slowly and then quickly press against the window, leaving it wrinkled. After that, we were all silent. All of us were terrified. My aunt denied being scared, but at that moment, I could see nothing but fear in her face. I wanted to run upstairs to get my parents, but I was too afraid to go up the stairs because it was right in front of the door. All I could do was text and call them, but they were too deep in sleep to even hear their phones ring. My aunt told the 2 of us to calm down and dismissed it as the wind. We all knew it couldn't have been, but in order to stay calm, she made up that excuse. And I must say that it was totally cliché. The next morning I told my mother about the previous events. She brushed it off by saying it must have been a bear or a deer. Another cliché thing to say. We both went outside to inspect and found my mom's decorations near the front of the door thrown off to the side. There were no scratch marks or bumps on the door. Everything seemed normal except for her decorations laying on the side. When the 3 of us looked at the door of the night of the event, there wasn't anything that could have caught our attention. Since the woods were 40 meters away from my house, we would have heard the trees moving with the wind, but we heard nothing. The movie was playing at the time, but it was strange how we all felt a sudden urge to look at the door, almost as if we knew that something was about to happen. The bangs were extremely loud and caused me to jump up from the couch. It couldn't have been kids playing a prank on us, because I'd been living there for about 3 years, and nothing like that had ever happened. Plus, I knew the neighbors well enough to know that they'd never do such a thing like that. There were exactly 3 bangs, one after the other. One could have honestly caused the door to fly out of place, but thank God that it didn't. What about the curtain? The only explanation we could come up with was that the impact of the bangs created wind, causing the curtain to react that way. But why did it inflate slowly if the bangs were rapid, and then suddenly cause it to go against the windows so fast after the bangs were over? My aunt thinks that the wind must have knocked it off its course. That's why we didn't hear the trees moving, and created huge columns of wind that must have caused the door to move so much. The gust of wind must have gotten inside the house from the cracks of the door, leading the curtain to puff up. Personally, it doesn't make sense and sounds like bullshit to me. She also mentioned that she saw a shadow outside, but she doesn't have an explanation for that. I didn't see a shadow outside though. My mother came up with an excuse as well. She said it might have been a deer or a bear, but why would a deer or bear bang their head or entire body for that matter into the door? Like I said, there were no scratch marks to prove it was an animal. No animal could have caused those 3 loud bangs. We've had deer sightings in the neighborhood before, but none that have acted in such a strange behavior. Usually, they would all run back into the woods. Bears are out of the question. Not once have there been a sighting of them. I should also mention that we had the lights from outside on. Why would an animal come on that close to a house, especially a door that is clearly being illuminated by a light? Like I said before, animals in general are out of the question. As I mentioned before, my aunt, along with my mother, have had experienced many unexplained events, and they believe in the paranormal. I think the only reason they tried to make up an excuse for this situation was to prevent me from becoming paranoid and afraid. It's pretty late for that now, since I've had my fair share of experiences as well. Now, to my aunt's friend, my aunt told me that when her friend was younger, she suffered from really bad night terrors. She said she saw things, demonic entities as she described them. She'd wake up screaming and crying. It was traumatizing for her. Her family had always been religious, and they prayed for her every night, and slowly, those things haunting her went away as she grew up. That really creeped me out and led me to believe she might have brought or attracted that thing to my house. Or maybe it could have been something else. I hope this never happens to me again. Please let me know if you guys think it might have been the wind that could have caused those 3 extremely loud knocks at my door, or an animal, or some kind of creature. I know they watch me. They watch me when I'm awake. They watch me when I'm asleep. I only see them during the day out of the corner of my eyes around the house, but at nighttime, they become so much more active. Sometimes they sit in the corner of my room and watch me as I lie there in bed. Other times, they walk around my bed, looking down at me. Other times, I hear them outside of my room, making groaning and growling noises and other sorts of frightening sounds. I've been subjected to these beings as far as I can remember. It's why I feel like I've developed sleep problems. I've never felt safe in my own bed, knowing these things are around and can get me anytime. My parents are aware of them too, and know that they lurk inside the house. We call these beings shadow people. They look just like people, except they're dark shadows and silhouettes of human shapes with red, glowing eyes. I know they're around. I always feel a heavy sense of dread, especially when they're in my room at night. Other times, I can sense them in my closet. From an early age, I've tried to sleep with the lights on. Every time it's dark, I can feel the feeling of evil and dread grow and grow, and I can begin to feel their presence in my room. I know they thrive in the darkness. My parents have talked about seeing them, but they only really seem to reveal themselves more and more to me. They always have. They're drawn to me for whatever reason. I can't quite explain it. I'm even afraid to leave my bedroom at night and even use the restroom, because I know they lurk in the hallways and other areas of the house. There's also times where I wake up in the middle of the night and I could feel them standing right beside me, watching me sleep. I refuse to open my eyes and look at them. They terrify me so much. I'm almost out of high school at this point, and all I can wish for this once I move out, that they will stop terrorizing me so much and let me have peace. I live in Canada, and I live in Alberta, and I have had some freaky ass experiences in my home. Well, my whole family has. Examples of things that go on in my house are stuff like sleep paralysis and things nowhere close to anyone being moved in front of us. Also, a whole bunch of creepy noises and things going bump in the night. My house is a very old trailer home on the outskirts of the city, and I'll give you the rundown about my family. My mom is a very religious woman, and is a believer in the supernatural, and a horror movie fanatic, I guess. My younger brother, who is 16 years old, is a very avid soccer player, and plays on Victoria, both the men's team and the U18 team. This will tie into the story, so don't worry. About 2 months ago, in April, I was home alone gaming in my room, playing some Counter-Strike Go with a mate. Well, I had played for about 2 hours, and I was kind of sick of playing Counter-Strike Go, and I decided to turn my PC off and watch Netflix on my phone. Just as I started watching a new show, I found on Netflix I had heard some noises from the kitchen, for example, such as the cabinets were opening and closing, plus the dishes in the sink were being moved. This isn't unusual, since when my mom gets home after my brother's soccer games, she puts some of the dishes from the living room into the dishwasher and puts the clean dishes into the cabinets. Well, without thinking about it, how long my mother was gone for, which was relatively a short time, she wouldn't have even been home for another hour or two. I left my room to see something in my hallway, just standing outside of the kitchen, which connects to the hallway through a short corridor. As I focus on the thing at the end of the hall, I thought it might be my brother. Then I realized that it doesn't have a shadow on the wall behind it, which was weird, and this piqued my curiosity, and I decide to take a harder look at this thing. My heart goes into my throat as I realize it's like a shadow, like silhouette, made of wispy black shit. As I stand just outside my room, I think it shocked me so bad I don't even know what to do without even thinking about it. I open my room door and slam it behind me, fearing for my life. All I could do was think of doing was calling my mom and telling her what I just saw, and she just tells me to get the fuck out in those exact words, and I did. I open up my window, which doesn't have a screen, and hop out of it and book it to my friend's house. He lives about 2 houses down from mine, and when I get there, I tell my friend what happened to my horror, and he starts to go pale and begins freaking out and tells me about one of the times he was at my house for a gaming night, and we planned on him staying the night, which he didn't because of this. He began by telling me his story. He was going to go to bed on the living room couch, and out of the corner of his eye, he said he saw something in the kitchen that kinda looked like a figure made out of a black mist. He didn't tell me this because he didn't want to scare me, and he told me he was going to sleep in his own bed that night. I am still living in that house, and sometimes I still feel as if something is watching me. I hope that I don't meet that thing again. My grandparents used to own a farm. It's a farm that they bought together when they were married young and have lived on that farm their whole life. My grandmother passed away about 15 or so years ago due to a heart attack, and my grandfather never recovered from it. He eventually hung himself in his barn about 10 years after that, which would make it about 2014 when it happened. After that, the farm got passed down to my family. My parents didn't really want anything to do with the farm or the property. They said I could have access to it and do whatever I wanted. To be honest, I really didn't want anything to do with the farm either, and have only gotten the creeps when I got out there. I wasn't super close with my grandparents growing up, so I didn't know my granddad all too well. I remember it was about 2 years since he had killed himself that I finally went out there to check the place out, since his death. As soon as I pulled up on the farm, I can feel the thickness of what I can only describe as death, despair, and loneliness in the air. It was January, and it was a pretty clear sunny day, but cold. I distinctly remember walking around the farm and just feeling so off. The only way I can describe it is I had literally felt my grandfather's sorrow. It didn't feel good. Unfortunately, because my parents lived so far away, and he had really no one close to him anymore, many of his farm animals died of starvation, and much of them were left to rot in their stalls, chicken coops, and pens. I remember walking by the coop and smelling a stench since many of the chickens had long starved to death and rotted away in their coops. The horses were the same. Some of them died and rotted in the pastures, while some died and rotted in the stalls. It was a disgusting sight to behold. I don't even think his body was really found for quite some time when he had died, and he was fairly decomposed. The only way they were even able to know it was him was to look at who owned the deed to the house, and then his body was later verified via his dental records. To reiterate, the barn is where he had hung himself, and that's the direction I was headed to. The closer to the barn I got, the more uncomfortable I felt. I was overwhelmed with the feeling of sorrow, despair, and dread as I approached the barn. I remember opening the barn doors, and inside seemed so much darker than it should have been. I felt immediate fear and dread wash over me. I could have sworn I saw eyes and shadows moving along the top part of the open barn. I would say the most terrifying part of all this, for me, was the noose that my grandfather hung himself with, primarily still in contact. Well, the noose part had been cut down when they retrieved his body, but the rope part was still hanging. This shook me to the core. What happened next was something beyond our realm of existence. It felt evil. It felt supernatural. It's like I was in a trance. The next thing I know, my legs start moving into the barn. I somehow felt drawn into the barn by some unknown source. I have no idea what it was to this day. As I stepped in more and more into the barn, the doors began to close behind me, and it got really, really dark. Unnaturally dark, especially since there's a small window at the top of the barn letting in fresh air and a little bit of light. As soon as the door closed, it was like the darkness enveloped me and came alive. I felt like my skin was crawling. I began to see shadows dance around me. I felt a million eyes staring at me. The closest I could relate to what I was feeling was imagining being trapped in a large room with someone with a weapon, and that you knew they wanted and were going to hurt you, and the lights go out. Imagine being on edge like this and knowing you could be attacked any second. That's what my fear was like. Something was holding me in this barn, and I don't know what it was. Some time had passed, and in the darkness, I remember gaining control, as I can only describe. I ran out of the barn and slammed the barn door shut. I decided it was time to get the fuck off of this property, going back to the car. I had to pass the house to get to the driveway. I remember as I walked by, I looked in the windows and I saw these dark figures staring at me with red eyes. I felt sick. I was frozen in fear, but my legs were determined to get back to my vehicle. Evil was all around this property, and I needed to leave, now. I eventually made it to the car and took off. I called my parents later that day and told them I wanted nothing to do with the property, and it was their problem. They still to this day have done nothing with it, or have come to visit. Like I said, my grandparents didn't really have anyone they knew or were friends with or close to in this area, so much of their property stays abandoned and left as is. My parents still legally own it now, as far as I know. The property is just going to sit and rot, like much of the animals that lived on that farm did after my grandfather opted himself out. I don't ever want to go back to that place again. I used to roommate with my brother when we were in our earlier 20s. My brother was only 2 years younger than I, so after we moved out from mom and dad's, we thought it would be a great idea to get a shoddy little shack of an apartment together. Actually, we ended up scoring a duplex together, with the other duplex being vacant for quite some time. We got a pretty good deal on it, and it was a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom with a decent-sized living room and bathroom. When we first moved in the fall, things seemed to go pretty good. I had just started a new job, and that was great. My brother was already working crazy hours at his job that he had, so we weren't home most of the time. It wasn't until a few months into living in this place that we began to notice and experience strange things. There would be times where we would both come home, and things would be moved around our place. It only got worse. Things escalated, and objects and things around the house were moved, doors left open, and even our mattresses being flipped, scratch marks on the door, etc. We had to call the police a few times because we were convinced there had been break-ins with the door being left open, etc. The police unfortunately couldn't find any signs of such, and nothing was stolen or taken from our duplex. It wasn't long after that when we started to hear strange noises in the other neighboring duplex. Sometimes it would sound like whispering. Other times we'd hear deep groaning sounds and other bizarre noises. There was a couple of times that I was convinced somebody was dragging chains or metal across the floor. It freaked me out at first, but then I suspected that there were homeless people living in it, and I began to put together all the pieces, and that's what's been going on and they had been breaking into our part of the duplex. I had called the landlord and had him get the police to investigate further. They found nothing. No signs of any windows broken. No forced entry. No signs of anyone having lived there in years. This is where my gut began to twist, and I felt like I wanted to retch. Something was going on, and I'm not a paranormal believer by any means, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. The sounds in the other part of the duplex got louder and escalated to screams at nighttime, tapping on the walls, heavy thudding, and what sounded like someone wearing boots made out of concrete stomping around all hours of the night. There were nights when I found it incredibly hard to fall asleep because of this shit. After a few months of this going on, my brother and I decided we should do something, but we weren't sure what. That is, until one evening, my brother brought home a Ouija board and said, "Let's see if we can contact the people next door." This shined as a red flag for me. A Ouija board seemed like a terrible idea, but I was so desperate for answers, and I figured any sort of closure would help us. Plus, I thought if we could come in contact, we could just ask them to go away. It worked out in my head. Surely it could work in real life, right? Wrong. My brother had always been into this super paranormal stuff. He was a geek and had grown up that way, and was always into Bigfoots and paranormal and all that junk. I'm not surprised he picked up a Ouija board at all. We waited until a night him and I were both off at the same time so we could make this happen and find out once and for all what was going on. Friday night came. He had taken the day off work and I was home after work. This was about 7 or so at night, early February, and we lit a few candles and let the house be totally dark. We set the Ouija board up and listened closely. Everything was quiet. No noises coming from the neighboring duplex. We began to place our hands on the planchette, and I let my brother lead and ask questions since he knew how to work this thing much more than I did. My brother said out loud, "Who is here with us in the duplex next door?" Nothing. No wind. No creepy sounds. Nothing. We sat there and waited for another minute in silence. My brother then proceeded to ask more questions. "Has anyone died in this duplex? Why do you make so much noise at night? What is your name?" Nothing. No sounds. Nothing. After all of this going on for minutes, I finally spoke up and I said, "I knew this was a bunch of bullshit. What are we?" There were no open windows, and just like that, I was cut off, and a cold wind chill blew out the candles. Along with the wind chill, we felt a force move past our bodies into the room. It wasn't even windy outside to begin with. There were no fans, nothing. No feasible way there could have ever been any sort of breeze come into the room like that, especially strong enough to blow out every candle in unison. It had a chill to it, an unnatural, evil chill. The force that came right along with it left us speechless and scared in the dark, just sitting there. My brother quickly pulled out his phone and shined his light. The planchette hadn't moved, but we felt something in the room we hadn't before. The room now felt heavy. We felt on edge, like something bad was about to happen. We quickly got up, turned the lights on, and got rid of the candles and the Ouija board with it. We didn't say much after that, and my brother got rid of the board. We decided we should just try this again tomorrow or something and go to bed. My brother agreed. I remember even my bedroom felt different. I had a really hard time falling asleep. I never felt a sensation so heavily before, but I felt like I was being watched, being stared at by hundreds of eyes. The lighting in my room was dark, but still dim enough I could make out basic shapes in my room. I eventually fell asleep, but remember waking up after having horrible nightmares. My eyes were adjusting, and that's when I turned white with fear. I saw several shadows standing in my small bedroom, by my bed. Just standing there. I thought they were people at first, but these people were more black than the shadows and darkness itself. I had never been so terrified in my life. I laid on my stomach and buried my face in my pillow, waiting for them to go away. I eventually fell back asleep. This had gone on for weeks afterwards. We had never gotten the Ouija board back out. Me and my brother weren't talking as much at all. I could tell things were going on with him too, that he wasn't wanting to open up about. Turns out, not even a week later from the initial Ouija board experience, his boss passed away suddenly. He was then laid off from his job shortly after. Our mother was also diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer and had totaled her car in that week and a half since. Things only got worse at our home. I would wake up suddenly in a cold sweat to the feeling of being grabbed and trying to be pulled out of my bed at night. I would see these shadows standing over me, whispering into my ear a strange language I couldn't understand. A language I've never heard in my life. The closest I could sound it out for you would be something similar to whatever these shadows were that were infesting my room began to become more and more violent as time went on. I also want to note that during this time, and since the Ouija board thing, that I hadn't heard any sounds come from the other duplex since. It's almost like using that board somehow sucked whatever was in that duplex into ours. I had tried to talk to my brother and ask if he was experiencing any of these same things I was going through. He wouldn't talk about it though. My brother is normally a pretty chatty Cathy, and I've never been around him so mute before in my life. It's like his personality had changed and he wasn't himself at all. He almost looked ill. I can only imagine what he was going through at night. If I would have only known. Not too long after, I remember getting home at night and he was in a dark place. He had taken a knife and was threatening to cut himself and was hysterically crying, telling him the beings in his room were driving him mad and they were trying to get him. They were trying to drag him to hell and he wanted nothing to do with it. This was a total and complete emotional and mental breakdown. I tried to calmly talk to him and tell him to put the knife down. 3 hours into this, and he finally let go of the knife and kept telling me he needed to move out and get away. That with our mom virtually dying miles and miles away, since we lived in a different state due to our work at the time, so we weren't able to visit our mom. I told him we would look and see what we could do to break our lease early and get out. The next day is when it happened. You'll have to excuse me because this is tough to write. I came home from work, and the house was quiet. My brother should have been home. I knocked on his door but didn't hear anything, even though I called his name. I still didn't hear any sounds. Something in my gut told me to open his door, and I did. I dropped to my knees and began sobbing uncontrollably. So much so, I felt like a part of me had died right there in that very moment. My brother had hung himself on his ceiling fan with a blanket. He was naked and had what I can only remember as deep claw marks all over his body. The police came and a note was apparently found that he had left before he died. They asked me if he had dealt with any mental illness or potentially schizophrenia. I told them never, and he'd always been normal up until recently when we had some things go on in that house. They didn't inquire more about that since they would have blown anything that sounded paranormal off entirely. I never actually read the note myself, and I have no desire to. But apparently I was told that he talked about being driven to the edge with these creatures taunting him, driving him to suicide. He said he finally succumbed and couldn't resist their allure. He was being taken to hell by these things, and that's where he was destined to be. I didn't even know how to feel about that. Days later, I couldn't cope anymore with everything going on. I broke my lease and left just about everything I owned there, and I flew back to be with my dying mother. This was about 14 or so years ago, just when flip phones were still big. It's still hard for me to talk about this sometimes, and I apologize for this being so long, but for me, it's a catharsis to write about this, no matter how hard it is. For those curious, my mother made it about another few months after I had flown back to be with her. I feel like her learning of my brother's suicide brought her closer to death. I feel like after that, she gave up all hope of living and beating cancer entirely when that happened. I almost opted out a couple times myself, but overcame luckily when I ended up meeting my wife and my life had changed. Anyway, whatever we did that one night brought those things into our duplex. The only thing I can look back and describe them were shadow creatures that haunted us. They apparently tormented my brother much worse than I. I wish I knew how bad it was because I would have helped my brother had I known. To anyone out there who deals with these beings, don't provoke them. Do whatever you can to get away from these demons.